his proposition was that every ideal is a judge. And that makes perfect sense, because an ideal is something to which you aspire. And the gap between you and that ideal, if it's your ideal, is felt as judgment. And so that's one of the reasons people are very afraid to have an ideal, to make it. That's why I wrote, do not hide things in the fog. It's like, well, you should lay out an ideal. You should pursue an ideal. Why wouldn't you? Well, when you make your ideal explicit, it turns into your judge. Well, then you can listen to that judge and move forward and transform. But, it's pretty damn harsh. Because especially to begin with, you posit an ideal, especially if you're in a mess. God, every bit of you is being judged as unworthy. Yeah. There's endless reasons not to want that. Technically speaking, again, seeing yourself move towards a desired goal is the essence of the positive emotion that nourishes us. And I mean that technically. That's dopaminergically mediated incentive reward. And so you don't have to get to the goal. You have to aspire to the goal and move towards it. And that doesn't even matter if the goal recedes, which it will as you approach it, because your ability to conjure up what constitutes the ideal is going to become more sophisticated as you move towards it. And you might think, well, that's terrible, but it isn't, because it means the game doesn't have to end. Right? Because if you hit the ideal, yes. It's like, oh, well, game over, reset, but no, that isn't going to be how it works. It's going to get better and better and better. And
it's why life is the perfect game. I mean, if you have for those of us who've played video games, you have a really good video game, or even a really good book, or even a really good movie series or a show, and it comes to the end and you're like, there's a huge letdown at the termination of this thing that's been incredibly engaging, especially
even if you win.
Yeah, exactly. You win and you get this moment satisfaction, but it's replaced almost immediately by the disappointment of the cessation of the game and the recognition that you're in a finite game when you really want to be playing the infinite game. And that's what life is, the infinite game of renewal of life. And that's why it's so good. We'll never replace it. It can't get better. And it's hard as hell. And it's hard as hell at the same time, and that's the way we would want it.
Well, it seems like that's the way we want it. I mean, that's another thing I talk about a little bit in the new book, is like, well, when you look back on your past, it's generally having done something difficult that you remember positively, I would say.
Yeah.
So then there's something about you that craves difficulty, optimal difficulty at least.
Yeah.
Strangely enough.
There's this idea in Christianity that we've discussed briefly, that the judge and the redeemer are the same figure. Now, in the book of Revelation, you may know this or you may not, Christ comes back as a judge, and he has a sword coming. It's a revelatory vision, that book. It's a very strange. It's the last thing you'd expect conservative Christians to believe in. Believe me, it's such a visionary hallucination, the book of Revelation. But Christ comes back with a sword coming out of his mouth, and he comes back as a judge. And he divides the damned from the redeemed, and most are damned and some are redeemed. It's very, very harsh. Now, Jung believed that the figure of Christ in the Gospels was too agreeable, too merciful, too tilted towards mercy, and that called out for a counter position, and that was the counter position of judgment. Very interesting hypothesis. But then there's this melding of the two ideas that the judge and the redeemer are the same thing. Okay. Now, this young man told me that his life lacked purpose and direction and meaning, and that he was nihilistic until he read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book I actually like quite a bit. I've read it 3 times at different decades of my life. And one of the things that's very interesting about that book is that it's an examination of the idea of quality, of the idea that there are qualitative distinctions between things, and that we have an instinct to make qualitative distinctions. And so a qualitative distinction is simply, this is better than that, which is a judgment. Okay, now what Ratzinger is hypothesizing is that the person in and of, how the modern idea is you're supposed to accept yourself. I think that's an insane idea, by the way. really, I can't think of a more nihilistic idea than that you're already okay. It's like, no, you're not. And the reason you're not is because you could be way more than you are. And so what do you want to be? You want to be okay as you are? Or do you want to strive towards what's better? And this young man, this Australian, he said that the reason that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance had such an impact on him was because he wasn't happy with his current mode of being, right? He didn't consider the manner in which he conducted himself sufficient. And the fact that the author of Zen, and it was Persig, laid out the notion that you could make qualitative distinctions, and there really was a difference between good things and bad things, or great things and evil things. It gives you direction. It gives you the possibility of moving upward. And Ratzinger is pointing out, at least to some degree, that human beings are insufficient in and of themselves and need the movement upward. And so they need to conceptualize something like the highest good, and then to strive for that. And the thing is that there isn't any difference between conceptualizing the good and being judged. Because if you're going to conceptualize the good and move towards it, what you have to do is separate from yourself all those things that aren't good and leave them behind. And that's why the Redeemer and the Judge are the same thing. And one of the things that's really appalling, I think, about our modern world is that we're rejecting the notion of qualitative distinctions. You say, well, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying that one thing is better than another. It's like, okay, fair enough. It's not fun to be cast off with the damned, that's for sure. But if people are, in fact, insufficient in their present condition, which seems to be the case, I mean, try finding someone who isn't, then if you deny the possibility of qualitative distinction because you want to promote a radical egalitarianism, then you remove the possibility of redemption because there's no movement towards the good. And it seems to me that it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for, well, it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for the equal. Because for us to be equal would mean, as far as I can tell, that we would all be equally unredeemed and miserable. And so,
we remind ourselves constantly to be grateful. And I'm always trying to watch what I say and to feel it out so that I use my words carefully. And I'm attentive to that. And despite temptation, because I'm very disheartened in many ways. I spent a lot of time trying to be of aid to people, let's say. And the consequence of that, I suppose, was that when I needed it the most, I got a lot of that back. And that wasn't something I expected. It's like when my wife was sick in the hospital, we had hundreds of letters of support. Prayer groups contacted us and well-wishers who said, we hope, we're praying, we want this to work out, we're thinking about you. It's like, wow, that's great. It's sustaining. And certainly, I read the YouTube comments and so forth, and thank God most of them are positive. I don't know possibly how people live when that's not the case, because negative ones strike me to the core. So I'm very I'm a very peculiar person for what I'm doing, actually, because I don't have that much resilience in the face of criticism. I'm very sensitive to it. But fortunately, there seems to be a lot of support, and constantly, thank God. It's a remarkable thing. I can't believe it. I really can't believe it. And I'm pleased people seem to be responding to this book positively. I looked at some of the public reviews on Amazon, and there's not a lot of them yet, a couple of dozen, but they seem to be trending in the direction that I would hope for. And so good. I hope this book is helpful. I tried to make it full of things that were helpful to me,